Welcome, everybody, to the 5th out of 6 Great Books lectures for this year. My name is Maureen Fitzpatrick, and I work with my co-conspirator, Michael Carriger, to create this series. And today we have a great book. Okay. As always, we want to thank the CoLab, Audiovisual, our, marketing, and Cervantes. Okay. This is Sean Harris. He is a professor of English. He has been at the college since 2000 and full-time since 2002. Primarily, he teaches some of our introductory writing courses and a wide range of literature, including intro to literature, intro to fiction, crime version of intro to fiction, British literature, both before and after 1800, and world masterpieces. Okay. He's been a faculty advisor to student groups, including the JCCC LGBTQ plus for several years, a safe space trainer and a diversity fellow. He earned his bachelor's in English and philosophy with a minor in Latin from Concordia College, and his MA and PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His dissertation was on decadent aristocrats of 19th century British literature, and he was an English department finalist for the Best Dissertation Award in 2004. If he is not here and he is not grading papers, you will find him on the tennis court, swimming, biking, playing video games, reading, watching science fiction novels, learning music. He chose today's titles, and we're very glad he did, because he wants everybody to read this particular novel, appreciate its artistic greatness, and understand its importance in the history of comedy, the tradition of fantasy writing, and its monumental place in the history of the novel. So, Sean Harris.
Thank you for the introduction, Maureen. Okay, so the overall goal of my presentation is I'm hoping to encourage you to read the novel, right, in as many pages as you can. It's a long novel. Okay, so let's just set some basic facts. Cervantes was alive in the 16th century. He's a contemporary of Shakespeare. This is the book. It's a big book, right? He wrote part 1 in 1605 at age 58, which I find extraordinary. I mean, he'd written other things. He'd written 20 plays. He'd written some other things, but this was his big breakthrough. And he wrote the second part in 1615, shortly before his death, because there was a pirated edition going around where somebody else had written a part 2, and he didn't like that, so he wanted to write his own edition. His biography is interesting. He served in the military and was injured. He was captured by pirates. He was 5 years in an Algerian prison. He worked various government posts, and sadly, he was poor most of his life. Here's an outline. We'll keep going. Okay, so how many of you have heard of Don Quixote and Sancho? Raise your hand. Okay. Keep your hand up if you've read any part of the novel. Okay. Keep your hand up if you've read all of the novel. Okay, nice. A couple, nice. Okay, and have you read Don Quixote in the last year? Okay, so this is why I wanted to do the presentation, because I think that Don Quixote should be read now, and it should be read every year, like Faulkner read it every year to kind of revitalize himself as a writer. Okay, I've used 2 versions. This is the Barnes & Noble version. This is the one I used when I taught it in class most of the time. It was a cheap edition. It's an old translation by Smollett. What I liked about it is it had the footnotes on the page, and some of the Spanish and some of the jokes were explained in the footnotes. Right. So there's that edition, and that's still available. The other edition, this is more kind of definitive edition. Tom Lanthrop has a PhD in romance studies, romance language from UCLA. This guy wrote I mean, he did a Spanish edition, edited it, and then did a definitive kind of translation. This guy's a superstar. And for people that have English degrees, if you want really sharp, focused, definitive, his notes and his introduction are really fine. Let's see. Okay, yeah, let's keep going. Okay, so I went 15 years in graduate school and I never read Don Quixote, right? So I was British lit, American lit, 1500 to the present, that's what we did. I never met Don Quixote in graduate school. So this is how I met Don Quixote. I'm in Barnes & Noble. I love the novel, The 100 Greatest Novels by this guy, Daniel Burt. So he's my kind of professor. He has a PhD in Victorian studies. He taught in New York University, and he just has a list. He's probably taught these novels. He has a 5-page introduction to each of them, talks about why it's important. And I just started looking at his list and teaching as many of the novels as I could. And Don Quixote, in his view, is the best novel ever. So I've tried, this is just the top 10. And if you're interested, you can email me. I have his complete list. I can email it to you. Yeah. Okay. So that's how I learned about it. Okay, so the first time I taught Don Quixote was from 2008 through 2011 in my introduction to fiction class. I love the novel. Let's just see if I can teach it. So what was my strategy? Let's just read the first 170 pages. I just divided it into readings, and then I go, well, maybe we should try part 2. Part 2 was a little bit more challenging, so I jumped around a little bit based on what I thought would be interesting for students. The novel has its difficulties, and so one of the things I hope that the presentation will do is help overcome some of the difficulties, because some people try to read it, and there's various things that prevent them from enjoying it. So one thing I did in the first time is I have all these supplemental handouts. So reading about medieval romances, background, like reading stuff about Sir Lancelot and Percival, a little Tennyson, an introduction to knights, that kind of stuff. Okay, so I did that for 3 years, and then later I go, well, man, I would like to teach Don Quixote again. So in my intro to fiction class, this time I decided to put together a short little kind of comedy unit in my fiction class. So I kept Don Quixote. I did a little Tristram Shandy, some Dickens, a little Wilde, a little Shakespeare, and then I taught 2 full novels, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And to me, they're kind of, those 2 books are inheritors of Cervantes's artistic vision because they directly use him, right? And then again, I had additional kinds of resources to help the students. I found that students benefit from having a resource in the classroom. So I'm going to talk about some of these resources during the presentation when we get to the appropriate section. Yeah, sure. Yep, okay, that's just more of the same. Okay, I also teach British literature, and one thing that has made it a little easier for me to teach Don Quixote is I like to teach the Arthurian tales in my British literature class. So there's lots of things to teach in the Anglo-Norman period, but I like to do the Arthurian stuff, and so I just take 4 weeks, and I'll have 1 week on King Arthur. Let's meet King Arthur. Let's have 1 week on Lancelot. Let's have 1 week on Tristan. Let's have 1 week on Percival. And what I found is that a lot of times students have heard of these characters, and of course there's the movies, but they haven't really read anything, right? So one of my approaches with this is kind of trade book, this is Andrea Hopkins, Oxford graduate. What she'll have is easier versions of it. Like first they'll give you an easier version, and then she'll go into one of the primary sources. It's a good way for students to get an introduction to the tales. Okay, and finally, Don Quixote is good enough to be in the world literature class, right? So of course, I've only taught that a couple times, but of course Don Quixote is in there and I'm going to teach it. So the essay assignment I had in that is choose 2 of these other great medieval texts and explain why they're as good as Don Quixote or Dante's Inferno, right? So I chose a poetry book, I chose a fiction book, and then for me, that's kind of, in my experience, just great literature. So that's the assignment I had them do. Okay, so why do I personally like Don Quixote? First of all, I like it because it's an adventure story, right? I love it because it's a fantasy story. I just love reading fantasy. I like reading books about people who like reading books. So the big thing with Don Quixote is he has this big library of books where he's reading all of these romances all the time. And then when the book starts, he's going to live out the fantasy of becoming a knight. That's sort of the basis of the book. It's a love story, although maybe not a love story the way you would think of it. He never really becomes a couple with Dulcinea. And there's other kind of pastoral love stories in the background. They're all out in the forest, and various things happen out there. It's a comedy. It's just hilarious, right? So one of the things that I think if you pick up the book, you will immediately appreciate is just the beauty of the comedy, right? The first 20 pages, once you get over the language issue, the humor is there, right? And there's some of his best sequences are in the first 80 pages. I like the whole sidekick with the hero thing that Cervantes did, and I think Sancho is really important. Recently, I've come to think of the story as a story about aging, right? So on the very first page of the novel, it says that that Don Quixote is approaching 50 years old, right? And it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that life expectancy went beyond 50 years, right? So saying that the character is at 50 years old basically means end of life, right? And of course, some people interpret that Don Quixote has some mental health challenges, right? He's commonly called mad in the story, right? So in his first salvo, in the middle of the night, he gets up, goes to the attic, puts on his armor, jumps on his horse, and starts riding out into the countryside without telling anybody. And it's the middle of June, right? So it's really hot. And nobody knows what he's doing. And he doesn't know what he's doing, right? And that's how the adventure begins. Okay, so here's a couple of historical facts. Let's see. Okay. So we're going to talk about Spain a little bit. Okay, so a couple of points, right? First, the 16th century is an important time in the history of Spain, right? It's really when Spain comes into its own as an empire. It's coming to its own as a nation. There's a lot of divergence between the beginning of the century and the end of the century. Also, Spain is an important place culturally because where it's located in Europe, right? It's close to Africa. And so there's a lot of Arabic influence, and there's Arabic empires in Spain, and then Christian empires. And at certain times they're coexisting, and sometimes they're in conflict with each other. But the cultural kind of cross-pollination is really important and is really influential on the history of knights. So with a lot of effort and Bob Epps' help, I got this map into Google Docs. It was really hard because I didn't know how to do it. But notice that Muslim Spain is in the south. This is early, right? And then Christian Spain is in the northern part. And by the end of the 16th century, the Christians have really taken over Spain, but the Arabs are still here. The Muslims are still here, and that becomes part of the tension. This is the kind of the background of Spain, right? So, for example, between the 8th and the 13th century, there's a lot of cross-fertilization between Christian and Arabic cultures. During this time period, we get El Cid, which is a very famous and important, it's one of the greatest texts of medieval literature. It's a poem. However, Robert Southey, who was the poet laureate in 19th century, has a nice kind of translation of it. I've taught parts of that translation. I don't know Spanish, but it's really a compelling story because he's a kind of Christian knight, but he sort of gets along with everybody. And at one point, he's exiled from the Christian north, and he has to go to the Arabic south. And he fights some wars and he gets some new leaders and people like him, and he's generous to his adversaries, and he's a family man. He's loyal to the king, even though the king has kicked him out. It has some of the medieval trappings of, for example, he meets a leper and he's kind to the leper. He feeds the leper. He takes the leper into his bed. And then later there's a kind of divine kind of intervention. He gets kind of spiritual acceptance or sanction, and ends up being a hero even in his late life. Anyway, this is Spain, right? El Cid is Spain. Okay, now what eventually happens is the Christian empire tries to take control of the country, and so then there's this distinction of the old Christians and the new Christian, and there's like forced conversions, which is not necessarily a pretty episode. And eventually we're going to get the Spanish Inquisition, which is enforcing this kind of thing, right? And there's some speculation that's about Cervantes' status because he was never successful. He never got government positions. He was always poor. It's a little bit uncertain. But the Spanish Inquisition wasn't uncertain. And the Spanish Inquisition, so I've got a few slides on that. Let's see. 1481, it's set up, but it still shows up. It still shows up in the novel, right? And like in one of the sequences, they're at the inn. There's a big fight because this muleteer is trying to have a sexual encounter with one of the innkeepers, and there's a big fight. There's a bunch of punching, loud noises. This is the hayloft, and pretty soon people are worried that people are murdered, and then they're worried that the Inquisition is going to come, right? Keep the peace in the king's name, keep the peace in the name of the Holy Brotherhood. And the thing that was really kind of dark about this period is people would inform on other people, right? And this becomes important for Don Quixote because Don Quixote acts erratically, and so people that are acting erratically are suspect. Okay, let's see what else we got. Yeah, sure. Okay, so the printing press is huge, right? Okay, so 1450 is, I think, when the printing press came about, and by 1500, there are 200 cities all across Europe with presses. And what this means is, for really the first time in modern history in the West, you can buy books, right? And so some of the books are religious, of course, but the other popular books of the time were romances, right? Like stories of knights. And so these became cheaply available. And so really the book became the first mass-produced commodity, right? And it's actually amazing that Don Quixote has this big library. And it's one of the important scenes early in the book where they're worried that he's not acting correctly. He comes home, they want to solve him of his madness, so they think the best idea is to burn all his books. And so there's a funny little scene about what books they burn, but then they wall up the library and pretend that the library didn't exist. But Don Quixote knows that the library existed, and so then he has a difficulty finding it. So, in Spain, we've got the Spanish conquistadors. They're kind of pillaging the West. Standing armies are becoming a big thing, so they're upping their might. Spain is a military power. This is all in the 15th century. However, by the end of the 16th century, Spain's empire is declining a little bit, right? We've got, it peaks maybe. Spain annexes Portugal, but by 1588, the Spanish Armada is defeated. By 1598, there's the death of Philip II. Some of this stuff I didn't realize, right, that all this pillaged loot from the West is creating inflation in Spain. For the everyday person, things are tough. We've still got this kind of religious scrutiny. So it's, in some respects, for some people, a tough time. And you see that in some of what is in the novel. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so the premise of the book is that that Don Quixote or Cervantes is making fun with knights. So there's all this stuff about knights that is useful to know. I've got a list of stories. So one way that you can make the story more accessible for you is to dabble in some of these other kinds of stories. I would start with stories about King Arthur, Lancelot, Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. I mean, it's an old text, but it's accessible, right? I mean, The Sword in the Stone is early in that sequence. Some of these books are quite long, but as soon as you realize that there's 5 or 6 or 8 knights and some of the chapters are about certain knights, you can just read parts of it and get something out of it. Okay, so when I teach Don Quixote, the way that I try to help students with Don Quixote is I try to figure out what his core characteristics are. And then I try to map that through other literature. So Don Quixote is an idealist. He's a King Arthur type. He's also a social justice crusader, right? So he recognizes that there's things wrong in Spain and he wants to fix them. Don Quixote is a fantasist. He just goes into imaginary land. He's a book nerd. He's always telling you how great he is, right? He's reviving the tradition. To me, he's a little bit like Beowulf. He's like an end-of-life hero. This is it for him. This is his final journey. He's mad. He's unpredictable. Yeah. Okay. So, just a couple. I won't be able to read all the quotations on him, but here's an example of what he says. Right. I'm the one for whom danger, great exploits, and valiant deeds are reserved. I say again, the one who will revive the knights of the Round Table, the 12 peers of France, the 9 worthies, the one who will cast into oblivion all the Platiers, the Tablants, the Avalants, etc. It's for me that these great deeds will be done, right? So he's saying he's better than all the rest of them. He goes out and tries to help people, but of course, sometimes he's hurting people because he's attacking them. Or misunderstanding the situation. But in one example, this poor shepherd is being whipped by his master. Don Quixote sees this as an injustice. He goes up and talks to them. The young boy has been losing the sheep, and the owner is losing money, so he wants to whip him. Don Quixote thinks this is fair. He's defenseless, so he says, I'm Don Quixote, I'm the righter of wrongs, stop doing that or I'm going to attack you. And so we have a fun, humorous little scene. And then he'll talk about it afterwards that really the issue is he's just trying to help people. One of the adventurers, he meets a bunch of sheep and he starts naming them as knights. It's a fun story. Oh yeah, here's the rams. So Sancho. So here's something from Sancho. Come back, your grace, Don Quixote. I swear to God that it's rams and ewes that you're about to act. What kind of lunacy is this? Right? So there's 2 characters. There's Don Quixote and Sancho is the one that's the realist, and Don Quixote is the fantasist. And it's the dialogue between them that makes the comedy, right? And Sancho doesn't win, but Sancho doesn't win. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about the fantasy elements of the story a little bit. So the great thing about the novel is that Cervantes explains how the comedy works early in the story, right? The first adventure, he's going out and he approaches this inn, and it just explains that Don Quixote sees an inn, and he sees there's 2 young women, prostitutes outside of the inn, and he just transforms it into a castle. And then there are ladies, royalty. And so he starts with the fantasy. He just makes it up. Okay. Of course, he's dressed like a knight, so everybody notices that he looks different. And it's real mishmash, the description of his armor. People don't understand what he's saying. Okay. So, for example, the innkeeper says, and seeing that strange figure, he was almost at the point of joining the damsels in their show of mirth, but fearing the massive weaponry, he resolved to speak to him courteously, right? So this guy is acting erratically, but he's dressed in armor, and he has all these weapons. So it doesn't seem like a good idea to, and then Don Quixote will say things like, Senor Castellino, anything will do at the castle, since my only adornment are my armor and my only rest is battle. So he'll say something like this. And then the innkeeper, who's a former thief and likes a good joke, says, in that case, the bed of your grace will be hard rocks and your sleep constant vigilance, right? So people around Don Quixote will start participating in the fantasy. And before you know it, here's Don Quixote sitting down to dinner. He won't take off his helmet, so he can't eat his food. And he's drinking wine out of a straw, and they're trying to help him drink. And he wants to, anyway, at this point he realizes he's not even a knight yet because he hasn't been dubbed, and so he's got to solve that problem. Okay, let's see. Now, sometimes what happens is we go total fantasy, Don Quixote's a knight, and then he'll return to reality. Like at the end, he'll say, oh, I thought it was a castle. I guess it's not a castle. And then he'll ride off, and then he'll go back to Fantasyland. So one of the things that Cervantes does with skill is really, he plays with the differences between reality and fantasy in such a kind of impressive way that, first of all, by the time you're 60, 70 pages in, you're in the fantasy. You believe in the fantasy. And it's almost like the boundaries are blurring for you also. You experience his new fantasy reality, right? I like to, in some of the other readings I've done, call it the simulacra, right? As soon as you enter the simulacra, then you just become used to it. It becomes normalized. Okay, let's talk about Sancho. I love Sancho. I mean, to me, the book doesn't exist without Sancho. He's the real hero in my view, right? So Sancho is just he's a family man. He's a farmer, lower class. He's a realist. He loves to talk, and a lot of the humor in the book comes from what Sancho says, right? So he doesn't know how to read. So when Don Quixote starts saying all these bizarre things, he doesn't understand it, and then he asks for clarification, but he tries to play along. But sometimes he'll complain, like they get in a battle and they don't win, and then he'll start complaining, why did we get beat up? But Sancho's very loyal. He doesn't abandon Don Quixote, and he's there the whole time. Okay. See if we can get something good here. Okay, we've already talked about that. Oh, let's see. Okay. It's at some point Don Quixote says, you have to stop talking. I'm not going to let you talk. And for Sancho, this is like madness, right? It's his version of madness, not being able to talk. So he says, Senor Don Quixote, give me your grace's blessing and permit me to return home. So he's ready to leave to my wife and children, with whom at least I can talk all I want, because you're wanting me to go with you through these desolate places day and night without being able to talk with you when I feel like it is burying me alive. Right. So Don Quixote relents and allows him to talk. Yeah. Whacks and punches. They get a lot of whacks and punches. Oh. So one thing that I hope to develop later in the presentation is later they're out in the woods, and for some reason Don Quixote decides to get naked. So that's the humorous skit. And Sancho says, for the love of God, Senor Mio, don't force me to see your grace naked. It's like a transgression. And then Don Quixote says, well, you're a coward, right? If you were a knight, you wouldn't be a coward and you could handle that. Okay, let's see. So here, I mean, on some of the right, I've got like Sancho's the loyal companion, right? when I'm separated from you, I'm assailed by fright and attacked by 1,000 kinds of anxieties and impressions. And let this serve notice to you, because from now on I won't stray an inch from your presence. It's very endearing, right? I mean, it's like Sancho loves Don Quixote. That kind of loyalty in the sidekick, I also see in Dr. Watson and the Sherlock Holmes stories, right? So I teach the crime fiction. So, the final problem when Sherlock dies, right? Dr. Watson says, "It is with a heavy heart that I take my pen to write these last words in which I shall ever record the singular gifts by which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was distinguished," right? So it's like Dr. Watson is Sancho, right? The sidekick. Okay, he does get some money eventually. Okay, let's see. Let's move on. Okay, so for some of you in the audience, you may know a lot about the history of comedy, in which case you don't need these sources. But for my students, I found that these two chapters were very useful in helping them provide some context for the comedy aspect of Don Quixote. So in the first one, I have this book, and these are JCC library books. I found this at JCC, right? The 7 basic plots. So there's a couple chapters on comedy, and so the author spent 34 years writing this book, and he's just read everything, and he'll have these nice little chapters where he talks about Aristophanes and key features and set it all up. The other book I use is Cambridge Introduction to Comedy. This is Eric White's. This is an older book, but I still find the chapter very useful. We're going to talk about some of those, but those are the two sources I have for students. Let's skip the old comedy, new comedy stuff for time. But comedy is a love story. Let's see, I want to go to okay, so in the novel, in order to be a knight, you have to have a lady that you dedicate your efforts to, right? So Don Quixote is chosen Dulcinea, right? And in Smollett's translation, what I like is the footnotes where he explains what their names mean, right? So Quixote is like thigh armor. So Don Quixote is the great lord of thigh armor is one way to translate his name. Dulcinea del Toboso. So there's a lime quarry in Del Toboso. That's Smollett's note. And so Dulcinea is the sweetheart of the limestone quarry. Anyway, the names are fun, right? So he dedicates all of his deeds to Dulcinea, although he doesn't really have a relationship with her. He just sees her in the village. He's liked her for 12 years, that kind of thing. Let's see. When he's on his adventures, he'll just think about her all night. There's later adventures where he sends Sancho off to go deliver a message to her. Okay, so eventually in kind of the history of comedy, what will happen is seriousness will disappear and you'll just get lots of lighthearted, implausible events. And that's really, that fits well into the Don Quixote equation. Okay, so 2023, why read Don Quixote, right? I think that one of the values of reading comedy and trying to work through the understanding of the comedy is it helps create kind of psychic flexibility, according to White's. It helps us become adaptable because we have to move between different realities, right? The comedy reality and the other reality, or the joke. Like, for example, it will create divergent framing. You'll get one frame of meaning and then you'll get another frame of meaning. And then the way that the joke is created is through those two divergent frames. So this gets technical, but in class, I'll explain it more slowly. Of course, some jokes are not funny to everybody, right? I mean, that's the difficulty with comedy, is that sometimes the joke has kind of, it's talking about cultural values, and there's disagreement on cultural values. And so, according to White, you can understand the joke without proving the prejudice of the joke. In Don Quixote, there's some jokes about Arabic cultures. And so he's negotiating. He's got a split audience. He's trying to be funny. Jokes, you can't always get a definitive definition of what the joke means. And so it can mean different things to different people. It's a way to talk about culture. Scheming and invading is a common comedy technique. So, for example, just glossing on Don Quixote, I'm the greatest knight in the land, says Don Quixote. Sancho says, then why did we lose the fight? And Don Quixote says, well, the reason we didn't lose the fight is because they're not really knights. Or it was the horse's fault. Like, there's all kinds of great jokes with the horse, falling off the horse, all that stuff. Or one of Don Quixote's favorites is, we were going to win the fight, but then a wizard came along and changed the reality, right? So when Don Quixote attacks the windmills, he thinks they're giants. And then he attacks them and he gets tossed to the ground. Sancho tells him, I told you so. And then Don Quixote says, well, they were giants. It's just that the wizard came along that didn't like me and turned them back into windmills. Okay, so probably one of the biggest challenges of the novel is that there are other things in the novel other than Don Quixote and Sancho, right? There's pastoral sections, right? And so my students sometimes get confused. What is this doing in the novel? So first of all, it's not a perfect form. It's hybrid. It's very large, right? However, the tradition of the pastoral is also a kind of fantasy kind of genre where you're going out into the countryside and you're taking on an imaginary role, right? And so there's a lot of this going on. So we get the goat herds and we get love stories. These were just popular stories at the time. And so Cervantes puts them in here. The way that I try to explain it to students is when you're reading these sections, try to imagine that it's a play, right? He wrote lots of plays. And so we've got these key characters. And one of the pastorals that's early in part one is we get Marcella, who is this beautiful, rich woman who lives, she's just been recently orphaned and everybody wants to marry her, right? But she doesn't want to get married, right? She's sort of a feminist for her time. And so but she can't escape the rules of her culture and her society. So what she does is she leaves town and dresses up as a shepherdess and starts wandering in the country to try to get her own independence. Well, the problem is the men say, well, I can do that too. So they dress up as shepherds and then they go after her, right? And so you get all of these kinds of, and then at one point, one of these guys dies for love of her. And then was it her fault? Was it his fault? He tells his version of the story. Later, Don Quixote meets up with Marcella. She gets to tell her version of the story. And pretty soon we've got this dialogue going on. And so it seems there's more depth to it than at first appears. It's not just we're changing stories, right? There's something going on under the surface. Okay, I'm going to have to move a little faster. So what I've got here is three voices. One voice, good sir, I pray you grant me, what shall I ask? I pray you suffer me to make a vow of chastity. I don't want to be in the relationship. We've got this other voice, women must be allowed to found their virtue on knowledge, which is scarcely possible unless they be educated by men. Okay, so we've got these two voices. And then in the middle, we've got Cervantes, right? Heaven made me beautiful, says Marcella, according to you, so that in spite of yourself, my beauty moves you to love me, and you insist that I, in return, am bound to love you back. But what I don't understand is that just because a woman is loved because of her beauty, she's obliged to reciprocate this love, right? Okay, so the first voice was Margery Kempe, right, way back in the 15th century. The third voice was Mary Wollstonecraft at the end of the 18th century, right? And Cervantes is in the middle. So what I would argue is that Cervantes is dealing with serious kind of feminist issues in these sequences also. Like there's voice and there's agency, and this is where the women appear in the story, right? Because both Don Quixote and Sancho were boys. Okay, let's see. We better keep going. Okay, now let's talk just a little bit about mental health. When Don Quixote is out on his adventures, I mean, he gets injured and bad things happen to him, but he's happy, right? When he comes home and they put him back in his room and they don't give him access to his books, he gets unhappy. And he starts fencing with the walls, right? So from some of the mental health research that I've done in another class, it could be that Don Quixote is suffering from what's called adhedonia, the inability to gain pleasure from normal experiences, right? He wants to do what he wants to do, and what he wants to do is he wants to read stories about knights, and what he wants to do is act it out, right? So fortunately, he has two friends that help him. He has the barber and the priest. So as long as he has his friends around him, he can behave in a way that allows him to be happy and avoid hurting people. But that's kind of a tension, right? The whole violence thing is a tension, and right, because the weapons are sharp, people are close to getting really hurt a lot of the times. So Cervantes does a good job of navigating that. We have to move to the next section, I'm sorry. So the final thing that I want to talk about is, I think that there are patterns that you can look at to look at the influence of Cervantes' work in other later works of fiction, right? So idealism, social justice, crusader, fantasy, book nerd, all of these things, adventure, fantasy, comedy, love story. And if you see those in other stories, then you can see the echoes of Cervantes. For example, I really like the Harry Potter stories, right? So does it fit the Cervantes or the Don Quixote formula? Well, yes, it's an adventure story. Yes, it's a fantasy. We have a sidekick, Harry and Ron. It's not really a comedy. There's not quite the love story. It partially works, right? So I've got some great stuff here, but oh well. Running out of time. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, right? I would argue is a Don Quixote-Sancho pairing, right? Doyle is definitely an adventure writer. Watson is the perfect sidekick. But there's no real comedy involved, right? So it's only partial. Again, some good stuff. Too bad. Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. Frodo is definitely Don Quixote in a certain respect. Sure, I'll take the ring to Mordor, but I don't know the way. I don't know anything about it. I don't know about the Dark Lord, but I'll do it, right? That's Don Quixote. Just go out and do the social justice thing, right? And of course, Sam says, I'm coming with you, even though he's going to drown in the river. If you haven't read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I love that book, right? Zaphod Beeblebrox, when he does the scan of his own brain, there's something wrong with his brain. And when he does the brain scan, he finds his initials written on his brain. He has surgically changed his brain to help himself keep a secret so that he can go on this adventure. Is one of the, so, and the fact that he becomes the leader of the galaxy is just bizarre beyond words, right? So he's definitely a Don Quixote type. Ford Prefect, are you crazy? It's a possibility I haven't ruled out yet. I know as much about myself as my mind can work out under its current conditions, and its current conditions aren't good. You could say that. You could say that about Don Quixote also. Okay, so too bad. It's my favorite part of the presentation, but I won't get to it. So for the people online, Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, it's just poetry. I mean, I loved creating it, but we can't. Basically, the 30-second version is I look at Huck Finn as a Percival type, and he's going on a Grail quest, and his ideal knight is Tom Sawyer, right? And because Tom Sawyer is the perfect boy. So I'm just so impressed with Mark Twain that he's able to take the knight story and translate it to children. But of course, Huck, he had a bad father, bad life. He's learning things. He gets on the raft. He's got Jim. He doesn't really understand. I mean, it's madness to get on a raft with a slave during this time period and go south, right? So in my mind, Huck Finn is Don Quixote, right? And Jim is Sancho. And it's a journey of discovery. And eventually Huck realizes all the things that are wrong with our country at that time period, right? The Duke and the Dauphin, all the scheming, the badness of slavery, how people behave, and he does it. Yeah, but that's all we get. Okay, closing comments. So excited. Okay, so here's the reason to read Don Quixote this summer. Discover why Sancho doesn't like blankets. Discover all the different ways you can fall off a horse during combat. And there's a lot of them. I mean, there's a lot of them. Discover what happens when you let your horse flirt with other frisky fillies. So the horse gets its own adventure. Discover how Marcella out-reasons her male suitors. And if you can make it to part 2, how good is Sancho at governing a kingdom? That's sort of a joke in the book that as soon as they win a battle, Don Quixote will win a kingdom and he's just going to give it to his sidekick. So there's a whole elaborate stunt in the second part where they set it all up. And what's happening in hell right now? Dulcinea was down there, and she's going to tell us. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thank you. That's what the time says.
We have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have one, apart from hearing more about some of the...
So when Don Quixote was popular, Spain was already really in a state of decline. And I remember reading a review of Forrest Gump back in the 90s, and the reviewer was rather upset that movie was so popular. And the reviewer drew a comparison between that character and Don Quixote and made a point that when a society takes, and this is the reviewer's word, not mine, idiots and turns them into cultural heroes and icons, it's a sign of that society in a state of decadence and decay. What do you think about that?
It's a nice hardball question. So it all depends, in my view, it all depends on what your definition is of cultural success, right? I mean, from an empire, I would argue empire is bad. I would argue social injustice is bad. So Don Quixote doesn't have a pragmatic approach, perhaps, to solving the country's problems, but he's at least recognizing the problems. That people are poor, people are being mistreated, there's prostitutes, women don't have rights, there's a lot of inflation, poverty. How are we all benefiting from what our great empire did for us? So, I don't think that Don Quixote doesn't have the government solution route. He has this is my personal way of dealing with the conflict of my time route, right? So I guess I don't know if I would agree that Don Quixote is necessarily a sign of decadence. He's so he's so culturally and artistically unique that he's not representative, right? It's a story. I guess that's my answer.
Do you, I'm just fascinated by this question. Do you see a connection between Forrest Gump, if you've seen that any time in the last decade and can remember, and Don Quixote? Or do you, I mean, I guess do you accept the underlying premise?
Okay, yeah. So stupid is as stupid does, right? So, although to me, it's all rhetorical, right? As a reader, do you think that Don Quixote is behaving badly, right? Should you just stay in your house and read your books, or should you go out on the adventure? If you go out on your adventure, if you try to go out and do something, should you say something, right? So Don Quixote is humorously not successful in solving the country's problems, and who could solve? I mean, empires in decline. I don't think that that's the kind of thing that one person or one artist can change. So, but it all depends, right? I mean, if you think that Don Quixote's activities are all just sort of silliness and nonsense and they don't mean anything, then yeah, sure. It's decadent, sure.
There we go. I think kind of building off of that, for me, Don Quixote is probably like in my top 10 novels as well. Read it a few times, and I think the more as I get older, somebody that deals with chronic illness, and oftentimes I kind of see Don Quixote as going and fighting these sorts of things, and it's kind of the same realm as like fighting chronic illness, things that people don't necessarily see that's real to you and that you don't necessarily can't explain to people. And so you just have to kind of just deal with it in an optimistic kind of way, even if people are telling you it doesn't exist. And I kind of think that in some ways, maybe the reason why this and so many other things appeal to people is because maybe it's an optimist during times that are very difficult. And just kind of in that sort of way, is it really more of Don Quixote being kind of like childlike optimistic in times of turmoil that is appealing, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So it's difficult to laugh when everybody else is crying, right? So comedy is beautiful that way. Although, okay, so everybody likes Beowulf, right? I mean, he's a real hero, right? Nobody else can do what Beowulf can do. But what's nice about Don Quixote is that you can see his pain, you can see his suffering, you can tell that he's 50, you feel bad that he can't get together with Dulcinea. When he loses all of his teeth, this is the end, right? I'm 50 years old, what am I supposed to do, right? What can I do, right? I mean, life gives me less choices right now. So am I gonna cry about it, or am I gonna try to do something that is, as you say, joyful, right? So I think it's nice to see the character having these kind of complexities, and it's not just a straight hero, and 16th century was not just simple times, and 2023 is not simple times, right? I mean, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean.